Hello, and thank you very much. Thank you for coming out on such a horrible evening. I'm delighted to be back here. Last time I was here, I was giving a talk about my science, and I was having to do it in evening dress with a white lab coat on top. So I feel a bit more comfortable tonight in sort of more normal attire. So I'm here to tell you a bit about my book, why I've written it, and where I think the challenges arise in our society that mean we don't have the whole talent pool coming together to deliver the best solutions for society. If we look at the disciplines, the different STEM disciplines, and see where the women are, or perhaps aren't, we can see if we look at this is actually American data, but it wouldn't be that different in this country, that one of the curves, these are for the different STEM disciplines, one of the curves, the proportion of women has actually fallen quite substantially, and that is computing. Back in 1990, it was a reasonable proportion, and it's been falling steadily ever since. The other subjects have all seen an increase. So in my own subject of physics, the numbers have crept up. They're not brilliant. But in a subject like the biology and life sciences, we actually have a preponderance of women in those subjects. And I'm not sure that any of those proportions are particularly healthy. Engineering, computing, physics, the numbers are dismally low and not changing very fast. In chemistry and biology, the numbers are much healthier, but as we'll see later on, that doesn't necessarily propagate to later in careers. So do we have a diverse scientific workforce? I've just picked out a few headlines, which are British headlines. So that's showing that we're not doing very well in tech. In physics, well, we're not going to reach parity for rather a long time. More statistics on women in tech, it's not exactly good news, and yet we know as algorithms become more and more important, if we don't have women saying, hey, hang on a minute, what's that algorithm doing? We have problems. Engineering is equally not very good. The proportion of women in the engineering workforce is miserable, basically. So the IET had a slogan, 9% is not enough. They reckon they had 9%. This was a few years ago. Maybe it's crept up to 10. So we have not got a diverse workforce. And so we need to look at where the problems arise and what can we do about it. So let me start off with early years. So in 1992, I mean, we all know Mattel produces Barbie. In 1992, they got as far as having a voice box in their Barbie. And this doll said various things like, have you got a crush on anyone, and things like that. But it also said, math class is tough. Which is, I mean, it's an American doll, let's face it, we'd say maths. But leaving that aside, it's still not a very good message for a 5-year-old girl to receive. So they changed the voice box. It stopped saying that fairly fast. And you might have thought they'd learnt from that. But I'm afraid, not particularly. So in 2010, they produced some books. This is Barbie Computer Engineer. That sounds good, doesn't it? But then you look at what this book said. If you read that, I don't really want to read it all out, but essentially, Barbie is being allowed to do the cute designs. But when she tries to do anything very serious in coding, she gets a computer virus and crashes her laptop, at which point the boys have to step in. It will go faster if Brian and I help, offers Stephen. Great, says Barbie. The boys conclude, step aside, Barbie, you've broken enough now. Now, personally, I don't think that's a very good message for a girl. It's implying that she's incompetent and she needs male help. And again, that wasn't very well received. It seems to have gone beneath the radar for about 4 years. And then someone actually looked at it and said, what? And the book was pulled. But there was this alternative version. This is feminist hacker Barbie. And there was a website, and you could send in suggestions for what should have been on the website. So our young girls are being fed a diet of maybe the STEM subjects are not for you, in an entirely, almost accidental way, I would say. So why did I write this book? So this book, you can buy copies later. I have to get a plug-in, don't I? I feel really frustrated that we start so early deterring girls. And most of the interventions that are done, let's worry about sixth formers. It's far too late by then, because if they haven't made the right choices earlier, if they've felt, I don't belong, we have a problem. So I would really like my book to be read by teachers, by parents, by journalists. I mean, there are just so many places where society accidentally gives the message that these subjects are not for girls. Clearly, and I'll come back to this later on, the same message does not apply in biology and the life sciences, because we see a preponderance of girls doing that at university. So we have to ask, why do stereotypes persist? Well, I think I've given you some clues as to that, but I'll give you some more. And why are women not expected to be scientists? Why is this not an appropriate career for them? So here is some word clouds based on advertisements for toys. And I don't think I need to tell you which one's directed at boys and which one's directed at girls. So boys are expected to battle their way through life, to explore, to take control, and the girls' toys are all about fun and magic and being beautiful. Now, my own view is that magic is not going to get you so far in the world as battling. Sadly, I fear that is true. So these were toy ads, I think in 2015, and a bit later, these come from Let Toys Be Toys, which is an interesting organisation. A bit later, they looked at the data again, and they said there was great improvement. I'm not convinced, looking at these word clouds, that that's actually so. Okay, love is now the operative word for girls. But it's a bit dismal, and I understand why marketers do this, why they say, we have to have girls' toys and boys' toys, but I think it's a bit of a shame that parents don't rise up en masse. I mean, some parents do, and some toy shops have stopped selling explicitly boys' and girls' toys, but nevertheless, the messaging rather gives it away. And then if we look at clothes, this isn't much better. So again, you can work out which size which, even without the colour coding. So girls are meant to be happy, to dream, to shine, best friends stay together, whereas the boys go off and are bold and brave and unstoppable, and they get involved with space missions. I mean, again, these messages on the mottos that are put on T-shirts are really extraordinarily stereotypical and not very helpful, and probably not very helpful for the boys either. But this really took the biscuit. I wanted to get brown cocks in one of those, but I've never managed. I think it's a bit small. It's sort of a 7-year-old's T-shirt. So then we have to think, let's step back. Let's not look at toys. What do you expect a scientist to look like? And unfortunately, Google will tell you something like that. I mean, the white lab coat is sort of de rigueur, bubbling test tubes and sticking out white hair. It's all part of this image. That's what scientists look like. My generation was brought up on Dr. Strangelove and Peter Sellers looking completely manic at that point. So that's another version of a scientist. Then we have some more reasonable ones. When I go into schools, I try to see if anyone actually knows who these scientists are. I won't embarrass you by asking you. That one is, of course, Martin Rees, who is the Astronomer Royal, was president of the Royal Society. Paul Nurse, who runs the Crick Institute. And that's Brian Cox without the T-shirt on. So that's sort of naively what I suspect the average member of the public, if they think at all about what a scientist looks like, will imagine. But the reality is most members of the public can't name a single female woman as a female scientist. So a study was done on this. So 2/3 of the British public are unable to name a single famous or infamous female scientist. And younger folk also are absolutely hopeless at being able to identify a female scientific figure. Last time I went into a school, I asked, and there was a dead silence, and eventually someone said, my physics teacher, and it was true. That physics teacher was a woman, so they could find a female scientist. About half can get as far as Albert Einstein. I find it quite surprising that most people can't name this one. Yes. As I say in the book, I don't think she's a good role model, but she did lead a life of extremes, let's just leave it at that. Rosalind Franklin, much more in the news now. Everyone remembers her as the woman who didn't get the Nobel Prize for the discovery of DNA. And here's another woman, Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who also didn't get a Nobel Prize. It's kind of sad they're defined by what they didn't do. I mean, Jocelyn Bell Burnell discovered pulsars, for goodness sake. And then on our TV screens, we see Hannah Fry quite often. So there are plenty of women out there if you think about it. But as I say, not you, I'm sure, but the average member of the public can't get very far in naming a female scientist. So again, why? What's going wrong? Maybe in school education. So I'll now show you a clip from Summer 2022's Commons Select Committee inquiry into diversity in STEM, diversity and inclusion in STEM. This is Greg Clark, who chairs that committee. And I'll show you a clip of him interviewing Catherine Bubblesing, who is the headmistress of Michaela School in North London.
But in a good school, with an outstanding school, with excellent teachers, girls are not choosing at least physics in the same proportion as boys might. What might be the reasons for that?
Well, like I said, I just think they don't like it. There's a lot of hard maths in there that I think that they would rather not do. And that's not to say that there isn't hard stuff to do in biology and chemistry. There is, but it's not.
Why would girls not want to do hard maths any more than boys?
The research generally, people, they say that that's just a natural thing. I mean, I don't know. I can't say, I'm not an expert at that sort of thing, but that's what they say. I mean, I don't.
So I'll stop it there. She went on in the same vein for a while. She says girls don't like hard maths. Look, this is a leading school. Their A-level results are wonderful, just not girls doing physics. She claims it's natural, but she's never looked at the evidence because that is not what the evidence says. Her school, in fact, has a lower proportion of girls doing physics A-level than the national average. The national average is about 23%. Her school's only 16%. I cut out the bit where she said, it's nothing external, we have good teachers. Well, lucky her if she's got good teachers, because not all schools manage that. But she obviously has not stopped to think, why are there fewer girls doing physics A-level in my school than the national average? She hasn't stopped to think, what is it about my school that might be putting girls off? And the reality is that girls do just as well with hard maths as boys, but they are led to believe by society, possibly even more directly by their peer group or by their teachers, that these subjects, physics, maths, are not for girls. Computing, engineering, all those subjects are closed books. So I can't prove this, but I think there was quite a lot of stink about this in the newspapers. Her evidence really raised hackles. And I think they stuck in an extra session to try and look at the sort of counter view, as it were. And I was very pleased to be able to go and present to this additional session to try and be evidence-based about things. So the fact that most of the images one sees of scientists, physicists, are white males, I think is relevant. And this starts, really young, the sort of message that society gives is that they are white males. And I think there is evidence to show that if you are black or if you're a woman, you don't see yourself fitting in. And I think some of the problems we see at later years are because girls, ethnic minorities, some ethnic minorities, not all, have already thought, I don't belong, I don't fit in. The fact that the national curriculum has no women scientists named, for instance, is pretty damning. And I think that this idea of, is this for me, we should really be looking at much earlier years than just the decisions made at 14 or 16, because they will subliminally have been made much earlier. So I should correct something I said in that clip. I believe there is one woman in the national curriculum, but it's still not a very good showing and not a very good way of convincing people who aren't white males, that they belong in these subjects. There are other curious attitudes out there, things that I really find quite hard to believe in the current times. So this is an article written by Christine O'Donnell in the Telegraph a few years back, and she was objecting to the fact her daughter had to study the STEM subjects. And she said, this focus on STEM subjects sends a message that makes her and me uncomfortable. Doing a man's work is more impressive than a woman's. So she has immediately jumped into the mindset that STEM subjects are male, and therefore her daughter shouldn't have to do it. That regardless of the fact that her daughter might learn something that was useful to her, and that the idea that writing is women's work is also quite surprising to my mind. The idea, I mean, she is in essence saying boys should not study languages, for instance. And I find that equally depressing. We'll see, well, this is some data from the Institute of Physics looking at the proportion of boys and girls in different A-level subjects. So we have very few women studying physics, around 20%. But in psychology and in English, we're talking about 70% girls doing the subject. And I don't think either of those are healthy. I think we should have more boys studying psychology and languages and more girls studying physics. Not to say it has to be 50-50, but I cannot believe these numbers are not being influenced by societal pressures, by the stereotyping that young children imbibe. So we can make things better for both boys and girls, I believe, and allow them to follow the subjects they really want to, not impacted by what society says they should. There is also an additional statistic which is interesting, which is that if you go to a single-sex school as a girl, you are 2 or 3 times more likely to study physics A-level than if you go to a co-ed school. Now, this is correlation, not causation, but it does leave me wondering, what is the difference? I know Susan and I were talking about this earlier, and she and I both went to single-sex schools. And an awful lot of female scientists I know do. So what is going wrong in our co-ed schools? So I see people taking photographs. This evidence from the Institute of Physics, you can find it all on their websites. So I believe we have problems from the earliest years, and that our schools, our society, our journalists are giving messages that say there are boys' subjects and girls' subjects, and therefore that will inevitably replicate in what the careers choices that people make at later years. But there's one other rather curious piece of evidence. Again, it's correlation, not causation, but I find it quite telling, and that's the concept of brilliance. So the x-axis on these graphs are some way of determining what the average member of the public thinks has a high brilliance content, what disciplines have a high brilliance content. And they looked at both arts and humanities and the STEM subjects. And the subjects that come up scoring really highly are philosophy, economics, and physics and maths. And naively, I think you can just hear that in sort of common parlance. Oh, you must be really smart. How many times have I been told, oh, you must be so clever if you can do physics. Why is that harder inherently than doing sociology? I mean, these sort of concepts are quite strange. But there is, and I should say, there is an inverse correlation between how brilliant you have to be to do the subject, or perceived to have to be, and the proportion of women. So the subjects I've written there, philosophy, economics, and physics, are all subjects where there are very few women studying at degree level. But the correlation is with some work that was done with quite young children. If you apparently, I mean, it was quite a small study from the States, so I wish it had been replicated. If you have a class of 5-year-olds and you ask them, you know, are boys smarter than girls, girls smarter than boys, children will say, oh, no, we're all the same. By the age of 7, girls are saying boys are smarter than them. What happens at that critical stage? Why do they think boys are smarter than than them? Why do they think that if you offer them a choice of toys, and this one is for the smart kids kind of thing, they won't play with those toys and games. They will think, oh, I'm not clever enough. And then you correlate that, so smart, brilliance, same idea. If they believe that boys are smarter than them, but you have to be really smart to do physics, then the inference is clear. So I think we have a lot of problems in our early years, and the problems at university, the problems in later life, will inevitably be fed by these early years problems. So I think we have to sort out our schooling. So you might think, why does this matter? I hope you're here because you believe it does matter. The upper picture is Marie Curie, again, sitting lonely in a sea of grey men. But the paragraph below is what's important, because the evidence is that minorities are typically better at innovating, better at thinking outside the box. But those contributions are often devalued. They are not taken up by other people, and the consequence is that the people who have done this work, their careers suffer. So that is one part of it. We are losing perhaps innovative ideas, and goodness knows we need innovation in our society to sort out our productivity problem and economic growth. So that's one part of the problem. The other part, if you don't have a diverse pool of people thinking about the problems in our world, you will end up with a sort of narrow silo-like mentality about what problems should be solved and what kind of solutions would be effective. So there's an EU-funded project, but it's based in Stanford, looking at so-called gendered innovations. And it's analysed situations where industry has tried to make innovations and got things wrong. So the very classic one is this example of crash dummies. If you test the safety of cars based on a 6-foot-tall, sort of solid American male, then you are ignoring the problems that a petite, pregnant female might have. And indeed, car crashes were the leading cause of fetal death. When the mother underwent trauma in a crash, the death rate amongst their babies in the womb was horribly high. But that was because no one had thought, how did the seatbelt fix across the pregnant woman? One can think of other examples, so that doesn't look very good. Try that. Heart attacks. It's recognized now that heart attacks present differently in men and women, and if you are a woman and you go to A&E, but you are not presenting with the classic male version of a heart attack, you may be sent home. So, it's a case of training doctors to recognize different manifestations of heart attacks. So different diagnostic techniques may be required, and recognizing that if you are presented with a male or a female patient, they may be manifesting the same underlying cause, but describing it differently. So there are quite a lot of situations where the fact that people think about men, typically white men, may lead to problems. It affects drug dosages. If you test drugs on men only, you think that female hormones are a bit of a complicating thing, so let's not worry about that. Then you will find that the side effects of the drugs may be utterly different in a woman from a man, and companies have lost an awful lot of money getting this wrong, because if they have to withdraw a drug when it's gone to market, that's really a huge hit to their bottom line. Away from healthcare, it's not just about healthcare. If you don't think about the issues that matter to 50% of the population, you're not doing your bottom line much good in that case either, because you're missing opportunities. So if you have a representative pool of people in the room making suggestions about what should be looked at, thinking about the solutions and how they will impact on different segments of society, you will actually end up with a higher profit than if you just sit there with tunnel vision. I am concentrating on gender, but a lot of this will apply to ethnic minorities too. That minorities in many ways are anything that isn't a white male, if you like, and there may be different ways in which this impacts on decision-making. So I feel very strongly that society collectively is losing out by not having an inclusive workforce, by not thinking about these problems from many different perspectives. But so far, I've only talked about early years. So let me go on now to talk about what happens once people have made their choices and started out on a university course. So here's some data. The curve on your left, or the graph on your left, looks at the proportion of women globally studying at university and at different stages thereafter. And you can see that internationally, more women than men start off on university courses, but you don't have to go very far up the career ladder, and the number of women plummets. Now, I said at the beginning that undergraduate courses in the life sciences are predominantly women, and that is true. That's data on the right. You can see about 60% of the undergraduate class studying life sciences at American universities are women. But that, again, that number falls off pretty fast. So by the time you get to professorial level, it's at about 20%, which is really not that much different from physics. So we have problems. Even having started off on an undergraduate course, we have problems in our universities. There are many contributing factors. I don't have time to go into all this, but let me just give you a quote from a friend of mine who went to a conference. She's a chemist. I think it was a conference in Germany. I may have misremembered. And she went around the stalls where people were selling equipment and everything. And one of the salespeople, a woman, said to her, "You look too sporty to be a scientist." I mean, what is it? Why do these kinds of things happen? When I was working on food as part of my research program, I worked on starch, and I had people telling me at conferences, and indeed on local radio, well, you only do that because domestic science is all you're fit to do. So the fact that I was trying to do some quite sophisticated experiments on starch completely passed them by. I was working on food, and that was because I was a woman and should be in the kitchen. It was kind of dismal. You may think in universities that everything is done entirely on objective metrics. When it comes to recruitment and promotion, it would be nice to think that. But sadly, the so-called objective metrics turn out to be a bit not as objective as you might hope. So women are typically awarded smaller grants. The success rates are pretty comparable now for women. They still are nothing like comparable for ethnic minorities. Their papers take longer to reach publication. This one baffles me. The idea that an editor will sit in an office and say, "Oh, that one's got a woman as first author. I'll put it in that pile and leave it for 3 weeks." I mean, I just do not understand why papers should take longer to reach publication. But the Royal Society of Chemistry did an analysis of all their journals, and this was their finding. So female colleagues of mine suspected it, and here was the proof. Women are typically cited less often. They tend not to collaborate with other women. One can debate why that should be. Probably they think the men are the gatekeepers to their future careers, and therefore they'd rather collaborate with the men. But it means that they aren't sort of building up their own networks of women. Letters of reference are often gendered. I have seen some appalling examples of gendering. There was the one where a woman was described as feisty, and she's only got as far as she has because there aren't many women in her field. And the panel I was on took one look at this and said, "We're going to throw that one out," which is good. This is progress. But these kinds of letters are still written. There are words that are positive, but just not what you really want if you're looking for a high-flying academic. So words like good team player, I mean, it's a compliment, but you're probably looking for words like brilliant. Being nice is not really, I mean, it's a good attribute, don't get me wrong. I would much rather work with nice people than nasty people, but again, it's not going to cause the recruitment panel to think this is the person we want. They're looking for words like world leading. So people write these letters with the best of intentions, but they can backfire. And then there's the case of double standards, and this is quite hard to pick up. So again, if I give you an example from a panel I was on, it was in the engineering area, and there were, I can't remember how many candidates had patents to the name, but there were two in particular. And of the woman, it was said, oh, she's got patents. Has she made any money out of them? Have they been taken up? And everyone, ooh, I don't know, the evidence isn't there. And then when a man came along with patents to his name, they said, oh, look, he's got patents. They didn't say, and have they been taken up? Has he made any money out of them? And one of the panel members said, hang on, we've got to treat these two the same. Either we need to see that they've had a success in their patents, or we just note they have patented things. We cannot do one thing for a woman and one thing for a man. And again, it was good to see that that was taken up. So there are all these things that look like everything should be a level playing field, and then subtle effects come into play, which mean it really isn't. So the phrase male by default is one that I use a lot. When I was the university's gender equality champion, I used to get involved in a lot of HR discussions. And one of the things at that point, this is some time ago now, that the university used to do is if it had a list of committee members, they would list all the names, and against the women, they would put F. And I said, you know, what about the other ones? What are they? And, oh, yes, you're saying male by default, and that was exactly right. So it's a phrase I find very useful. It's sort of hidden expectations, and that we have to single out the women. And of course, as people get more conscious of non-binary choices, this is going to have to go out of the window anyhow. But there are lots of other assumptions, perhaps more pernicious, that the woman is the caregiver, and therefore she can't be serious. This is something that's unspoken, but I think very commonly believed. The presumption that what was good enough for me 25 years ago kind of thing is good enough for people now, so why aren't they at the bench 7 days a week sort of thing. This idea of presenteeism, I think, is very damaging, and damaging for mental health as well as, you know, just on having a work-life balance. So we need to be very aware of what underlying assumptions are lurking in there. So another example, collaboration. The vision of what a scientist should be is typically this mad scientist with a test tube and sticking up hair, the lone genius. And in reality, that's not how science is done now. An awful lot of science is teamwork. Think CERN. How many hundreds of people were involved in tracking down the Higgs boson? And there are lots of examples where large teams are really absolutely crucial. But how do you value collaborative behaviour? If you've got 100 people on a paper, how do you say who's really made the most significant contribution? And I think that's something we really haven't factored into a lot of our processes in the university system. Now, I'm going to give you a control experiment. We have Barbara and Ben here. And you might think, how do you do a control experiment? How can you really tell that people think a man is better than a woman? So let me explain. So that was a headline in a newspaper. Barbara, born Barbara, transitioned at the age of about 40 and became Ben Barres. And he caught someone saying, Ben Barres gave a great seminar today, but then his work is so much better than his sister's. Now, I know that's only one data point, but it is absolutely telling. Same person, same science. They just jumped to conclusions that the man must be better than the woman. And I find that pretty disturbing, really. But I think it shows just how much implicit bias there is. And at this point, I should say, unless you think I'm having a go at the men in the audience, I'm not, because women are just as biased as the men. Women make assumptions, we all make assumptions about different aspects. So it isn't that the men are out to do down the women, it's that we as a society tend to think that men are better than women. Now, I think universities have a particular problem that I would like to think industry doesn't have. I wish universities didn't have this problem. But if you're doing a PhD, say, you are very dependent on your research supervisor. So it's sort of, if you like, a single point of failure. And if things go wrong, if the supervisor is a bully, or if he has favourites, or if he doesn't know how to interact with a female of the species, for whatever reason, that relationship may go wrong. And it's a real problem then. I think universities are moving towards the point where there should be a second supervisor, which is what happens in Cambridge, but they're often very subsidiary. And if the head of the group, male or female, permits a hostile environment, a toxic environment to develop, so that there's a lot of banter, there's a lot of unpleasant conversation. If a peer decides that they're not going to let the women in the group use this piece of equipment, whatever it may be, quite apart from real sexual harassment and assault. There are lots of low-level aspects of bullying that may go on in a research group, and it's really hard to do anything about it, because if you are on the receiving end of this, but you are hoping to get a job after your PhD, as most people naturally would, and you are reliant on your supervisor writing a letter of reference, you are in a weak position to complain, or to complain either to HR or to the supervisor. And that is a real problem, and I don't think universities have got to grips with this at all. And sometimes, even more so, they don't want to hear, because the head of the group is bringing in millions of pounds in research grants, so why would they get to a point where they might have to sanction him or throw him out or something? And I think this is a real problem and needs to be addressed much more robustly. This figure was taken from a report from the National Academies in the US, explicitly looking at sexual harassment of women, but it shows very much how there are the really overt signs of harassment. That's the tip of the iceberg, and then all the low-level stuff that goes on below. And a lot of that is invisible unless you look quite hard, but can make the individual, and again, it can be a man who's being bullied. This is not unique at all. And certainly ethnic minorities are on the receiving end of a lot of this. Why would you want to stick around in a hostile environment, I think, is the bottom line. There are so many ways in which it may just get too much. And if you were ambivalent before you started, well, maybe you'll leave. If you're worried about the two-body problem, whether you and your partner can get jobs in the same place, maybe it's just easier to drop out. There are all kinds of things. But the graphs I showed of the fall-off in proportions of women as you go up the ladder, I think this graph has a lot to do with it, that the atmosphere can just get sufficiently unpleasant that it doesn't feel worth continuing. Mostly I haven't had much sexual harassment against me, but I've certainly, as I've mentioned, had attacks on my science. There's been domestic science. The kind of situation where you turn up somewhere and people say, oh, I wasn't expecting a woman. It's just so annoying. The assumption that I'm part of the secretariat, you turn up at a committee meeting and you get complaints about the way the documentation was produced, and then they realise that actually you're a committee member and you're not part of the secretariat. Student evaluations commenting on my dress. I looked like a women's lib officer. I was never quite sure what that meant. How should I have dressed? And of course, sexual harassment. I've had some, but I think I've got off quite lightly, really. But I should also say there are lots of wonderful men out there, wonderful women too. And my main mentors have been male, and I've had fantastic mentors. And when I wrote the book, I realised I got quite emotional writing about these people who made so much difference to my life. Now, when I was writing the book, I decided that I shouldn't rely on my own experience. And in particular, the sense that when I got to be mid-career, when I got to be a professor, when I got to be an FRS, that actually things got worse, not better. And I was curious to find what other people said. So I tried to write to some female colleagues of mine without, I'm not a sociologist, without steering the questions I was asking towards particular answers. But I'll just pull out some of the quotes of the responses I got. On a bad day, I wonder why all of the people who I work with seem to be committed to change are women. And that some, but by no means all, of my male colleagues get to carry on with their jobs as normal. And I think this is very often perceived that, groups, for instance, do Athena Swan, are typically women or people of colour. And that is very often the case. The men don't step up to the mark as often. Someone else described this feeling that you're sort of kind of excluded from the networks, and then you find you've walked into something without knowing it was there because you can't see it. And the assumption that you are a threat, which was certainly a feeling I had at times, that people saw me as a threat because I wasn't like them. The idea that you turn up as a senior dean or pro-vice-chancellor or whatever, and people assume, if you're a woman, you must be part of the administration, you must be head of HR or something. That, again, is sort of very depressing, that you have to explain yourself every time. No, I'm a professor just like you. And this very common reaction that you put an idea forward and no one takes any notice, and then a man says it, and everyone says, oh, what a good idea, John. And this is not a new idea. So this cartoon is Punch 1988. And it's committee meeting with a lone woman. We've all been there. That's an excellent idea, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men would like to make it. And as I say, that was 1988, and most of my colleagues would recognise that today. Not always, not by any means always. And I have to say, I said mid-career was probably the hardest part of my life. I'm well past this stage, I'm glad to say. If I say something, people do tend to listen, which is good. Now, let's get to the point where, what can you do? So first of all, I would say something about bystanders. The idea that if you see bad behaviour going on, be it in the lab, be it when you've all gone down to the pub to celebrate someone, some achievement, someone having a baby, someone having passed their PhD, whatever it may be, if there is bad behaviour, it is much easier for someone else to call that out than for the victim. And I think it can feel quite scary. I mean, it's like the announcements, the public service announcements on the tube about if you see a woman being harassed, what can you do? The least you can do is ask the victim if they're okay. That is the least, and that is not threatening. I mean, there are situations where it might be threatening, and tube late at night is probably one of them, but down the pub shouldn't be, depending on your pub. But if a low level of aggression or unpleasantness persists, then it's going to be bad for everyone. Everyone's going to feel uncomfortable. So I think it's important that those people who are not directly involved do try and step up. The last quote there came from a study that was done by Murray Edwards, which is still an all-women's college, adjacent to Churchill, my own college. And they were looking at women in the workplace. They interviewed a lot of their alumni. And the thing that struck them, and it struck me, was that they are saying the non-supportive workplace culture was more detrimental than anything else. People always tend to say, it's because women want to have babies. Men don't want to have babies. But the idea that actually it's the culture that is really detrimental, not trying to juggle work-life balance. I think that's very important to remember. And I have come to believe, which my generation of women who became professors around the time that I did absolutely didn't believe. I think it's really important to work with men as allies. There was a group in Cambridge around the turn of the century where there were still very few female professors, and they had a group which is called the Senior Women's Action Group, and they deliberately excluded men, and they just about tolerated talking to the Vice-Chancellor, who was a man at the time. I think it's really important that we're all in this together, that it will improve things for everyone if we all recognise that this is a problem for everyone. And inclusion is not something that one group does to another group. So if senior management is, as it often is, largely male, one needs to find allies elsewhere and come together to try and make a difference and to point out to the senior leadership what the challenges are. And as I said, in the context of calling out inappropriate behaviour, men speaking up are really, really important. Now, I started off with Barbie, so it's probably appropriate I come back to her at the end. I also talked about the importance of role models. And Mattel, I think, have recognised some of the issues. So after Sarah Gilbert got so much attention for all her brilliant work on the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, they created a Barbie in her likeness. And this is her. I'm told you can't get hold of it because it was obviously a limited edition. But it's a nice idea. It's just a shame you can't buy it. We need diverse teams. We really do. Whatever problems the world is facing, and goodness knows we're facing enough, having the full talent pool coming together from all our different perspectives is really important. So my conclusions are that we live in a society where things go wrong practically from birth, in my view. We need this diversity of perspectives. We need to do a better job of making sure that both boys and girls can make the choices that are right for them, not the choices that society thinks they ought to make. So I think, and something I have said over and over again in any opportunity, I do think Ofsted school inspectors have a role to play in this, because if they went into the schools and said, well, how many girls are progressing to physics A level, or what do you do to make sure that the boys do some cooking and the girls get to play with the bricks? You know, I think they could raise this. It's about incentives if this was recognised as an issue. But it isn't, because, of course, if you look at exam results, girls do fine, but that's not the end of the story. So we need a change in culture, and I believe everyone has a role to play. So I will leave you with a checklist of things that might be doable by each and every one of you. This was a list I drew up for The Guardian many years ago now, about 7 years ago now. I think it stood the test of time, because whatever your role in society, however senior or junior, whatever career or stage in your academic progression you're at, I think there is something, maybe several somethings, that you can do in there. And I hope you will go out there and spread the word, as it were, because we need to do better. Thank you.